Hi, everybody, and thank you so much. Welcome. We have a lot of people on the line, so I'm glad that the topic of describing complex images generated so much interest, and I'll just throw out a special welcome for anybody who's persevering through Hurricane Sandy. I appreciate you being with us. We have a lot to talk about in the next hour, and I would like to leave time for Q&A, so I'm just going to dive right into it. I'll start with a little intro, and then we'll get into some guidelines about describing complex images. And we're going to spend about a half an hour or so looking through specific examples of how to approach description for complex images. We're going to talk about how to actually add that image description to digital media. Look at some of the offerings that the Diagram Center is providing in terms of tools and resources for adding image description to digital media. And image description is not always the best or the only way to provide access to complex images, so we'll look at some of the alternatives that are out there currently and ones that are being developed. So moving right into it. So Diagram Center, what is it? Well, it's an acronym. It means Digital Image and Graphic Resources for Accessible Materials. It's a 5-year research and development center funded by Department of Ed, under OSEP, and the major partners are Benetech and the National Center for Accessible Media and the U.S. Fund for DAISY. And the Diagram Center is quite a busy place. Well, it's not a place, but it is a thing. It's an organization. And here's a list of some of the things the Diagram Center has been working on in its 3 years of existence, and highlighted are activities that we'll be discussing today. We're doing description guidelines training. We're going to talk about scalable vector graphics and 3D printing, the POET description authoring tool, and the content model. I'm talking to you today from Boston's public television station, Channel 2 WGBH, and the National Center for Accessible Media. We are a 20-year-old R&D and consulting center, and we're also very much involved in standards work, and everything involved, everything having to do with access to digital media for people with sensory disabilities. So digital images, access to digital images is the topic of today's conversations. Also, they're being more and more prevalent out there in digital media. In the upper left, we have the CDC website, and there's many, many websites that are now providing alternate text for images. CDC does a great job, so you might want to check them out as an example. There are tools out there like iBooks. Apple's iBooks authoring software now includes a pretty straightforward way to add alt text to images if you're creating a book in iBooks. Bookshare provides thousands of titles, accessible digital titles for people with print disabilities, and more of those titles now include image descriptions. And in the lower left-hand corner, we're seeing K-12 assessments, high-stakes assessments that are in the next couple of years moving online. They will be digital, and they will include image descriptions. And if high-stakes assessments are going to have image descriptions, you know that in the classroom will also begin to include image descriptions in digital materials. So these 4 examples they are just examples, and they're meant to show that accessible digital images for a generation of students are going to be more expected than the exception. At least that is the hope. We're going to move right into guidelines. I'll pause momentarily in case Julie's noticed any questions anybody has off the top.
No questions, Bryan.
Okay, great. Then we'll go right into guidelines so that we can get into the examples with plenty of time. Here are examples really for any sort of nonfiction writing or nonfiction technical writing, which is, in a sense, really what image description is. Know what you're talking about. Be a subject matter expert. If you don't know what the image contains, there's no way that you can write a description that will provide access to it. Write well and take care to review spelling, grammar, and punctuation, because those will trip up a screen reader. They'll certainly trip up someone who's relying on their screen reader to hear the description. Monitor the length of your description, the vocabulary used, the sentence structure to minimize cognitive load. And I'll actually spend quite a bit of time in the example section discussing ways to do that and why that's important. Review the image in context to ensure the proper tone, structure, and vocabulary. You want to make sure that you know what the context of the image is. Is it in a 5th grade social studies book? Is it in a higher ed science text? The image description that you write will change, even if the image is the same. The vocabulary and the tone that you use will change depending on the context. Also, if you're in an assessment context, your image description will likely be different than if it's in a teaching context. Have access to reference materials, and also your description should be edited by hopefully someone who hasn't seen the image, or like any good writing, it should be edited just to make sure that it's consistent and clear and that it's done well. Talking specifically about image descriptions, it's very helpful to consider 3 basic questions each time you approach an image to write an alt text for them, especially complex images. And they're very simple questions. One is, why is the image there? Who is the intended audience? And those are really context questions again. And then 3 is, if there is no description, what will the viewer miss? And notice that number 3 doesn't say, how do I include all of the visual information in this written description? It's almost the reverse. It's, if there's no description, what will the viewer miss? In other words, what are the most important elements of this image that I need to get across to the reader of the alt text? Now, most of the description techniques and approaches that I'll be talking about are based on research that we led here at NCAM for the National Science Foundation, and through that research process, we developed something called the STEM description guidelines. STEM, of course, is science, technology, engineering, and math, and we found that the approaches for those types of images can be sort of used and expanded across disciplines, because complex images occur in social studies books and all other sorts of disciplines. And if any of you have ever seen one of my STEM description guidelines trainings, you know that I can spend either an hour or a full day on those, and here I've boiled it down to 10 words. So the STEM description guidelines are: be brief, focus on data, not extraneous visual details, write as clearly as possible. To help you write clearly, you can use drill-down organization, meaning start with a general overview and then spread out to more and more specific information about the image. And utilize HTML, tables, lists, and MathML. And as promised, we're moving right into the examples. And I think that these are going to be helpful, and will probably generate some questions for the end of our session. So parts of a complex description, I really like to break things down to their most basic parts, and that's what this is here. Regardless of the complexity of an image, there's really 4 main parts to it. There's the title, and that has to be included in your image description. The construction of the image, what is it and how is it built? Is there a summary or an overview? And then what is the information in there? What's the data? And the next slide shows the image description for that line graph. And of course, you're not going to have these headers written into your image description, but they're here to help you as we walk through here. So there's a title. The line graph is titled Foreign Trade of Country X. 1968 through 1980 in US dollars. The construction, what is it? We know it's a line graph. And then the construction is there's two lines on the graph, a dashed line labeled exports, one labeled imports, and then the information about the horizontal and the vertical axes. What are those? The summary, I'll read the summary in its entirety. It's 2 sentences. The export line begins in 1968 at $3 billion, rises steeply, then drops, then shoots up to $15.5 billion, then trails off to $10 billion in 1980. That's the exports line. The imports line begins in 1968 at $2 billion, and rises steadily to $8.75 billion in 1980, except for 2 minor dips. Now I'm going to switch back and forth between the next slide and this slide. The end of the image description should provide all of the specific data points that are provided in the graph in case somebody needs that information. Okay, so you'll notice we didn't provide all of the information in those 2 sentences, those general summaries of what the graph is about, but all of that is provided here. And providing an HTML table, if someone's using a screen reader, allows independent access and quick access to the numbers. It's a great way to do it as opposed to wrapping all of that data into sentences. I'm going to jump back to the summary. You'll notice when I was talking about writing style and vocabulary, just quickly I want to point out that, when we look at this line graph, what do we see? The top line, which is exports, goes up, goes down, goes up, goes down, and sort of trails off. And imports is sort of a pretty steady increase. That's the most general information, the basic summary of this graph. Okay? And look at the language that's used here. For exports, we say rise steeply, then drops, then shoots up, then trails off. Whereas the import line rises steadily, except for 2 minor dips. So your use of vocabulary just a single word here or there can express a lot of information, and it's important to choose your words wisely. Okay, so that was just sort of an introductory example of the parts of the complex diagram, and we're going to look at those 4 parts of a complex diagram in what I found really these 5 different kinds of commonly occurring complex images. Complex images that should go straight to a table, others that should go straight to a list. And sometimes they can confuse you a little bit, and we'll look at an example where you might actually create something in a table and then realize you've actually made the description more complicated than the image itself. There are other complex images that just have a lot of information, and you're not going to be able to reduce the image description down to a data table or a couple of sentences or a simple list. It's just there's a lot there, and the best you can do is provide it in a way that is easily accessible and makes sense as you're moving through it with the screen reader. There are images that are tons of words. They might have pictures in them. They might have lots of graphics or images, but those are really secondary to the words that are provided in the image. We're going to look at an example of that, what I mean. So you can cut through most of that and provide the most important information in those, which are the words. And then we're going to look very briefly at a couple of examples of illustrations and cartoons. I'll give you some pointers and some approaches to those types of images, but we're going to focus mostly on those top 4. So here's an example.
Brian? Yeah. We have a question. Carolyn Power is wondering if there are specific guidelines for writing descriptions for images and assessment items. That is, how do you do it without giving away the answer?
There are. I worked on an EAG grant called Description Enhanced Assessments that was led by the state of Utah, and that final report is just coming out. The website is up if you just want to use your search engine and look up Description Enhanced Assessments and maybe NCAM or Utah, and that should come up, and we can add that link. I'm sure the link is at the Diagram Center website. And what that project did was come up with a list of considerations, but that is a world or an aspect of image description that is being developed really right now in conjunction with online tests being developed. It's actually very much in process, but there are certainly considerations that we know about right now. So there we are. I'm going to continue moving on. That's a great question. So straight to table. Here we have a graphic which has multicolored headers. It has little icons of little men and little women. But very quickly you can probably see that this is a data table and should be converted into a data table. Okay? And all of that other, what I call extraneous visual information, can just be left out. We have a table titled Expanding Education, Decreasing Illiteracy, and boom, here we have it. We have three columns and the information. The only thing you might want to add to that, oops, I'm having trouble going back. Here we are. If you look at this in a glance, do you see a summary? Do you see a general trend? And you do. You see that as the years increase, the school-age population increases, and the percent of illiteracy decreases. Okay, without any specifics, that's what you see: an upward trend in population, downward trend in illiteracy. Depending on the context of the image, that may or may not be appropriate, because this might be in a section of a text which is requiring the student to actually read a table and glean that information for themselves. So that's why context is important. But that one, you know, we're straight to table. We're ignoring the colors and the little icons of people. They're simply not important. Now here's a fairly simple bar graph, but it has, you know, each bar has three different pieces of information. We have the title, of course, billion. Oh, we don't have the title. Sorry, I got that off when I put that in here. But it's we have three pieces of information for each bar: Marshall Plan, so the name of the plan, the years, and the giving in billions per dollar. Now that could go straight to table, but this is also possibly a list. And what I found when I made the table, it almost became more confusing, because the dates are sort of not irrelevant, but they're less important than the amounts. So I just put in a list and I read through it, and some of this you will go back and forth. You might create a data table, or you might create a list and say, and listen to it on a screen reader and say, you know, that really isn't the best way to do that. It's a little more confusing. I want to jump to, I have another really good example of that coming up. So we have some images, but obviously it wouldn't make sense to write a long paragraph describing the tan and brown and green bars and their relation to each other in any way other than the specific information here: the title, the date, and the amount. So here we have a flow chart, which is, flowcharts usually go straight to a list. As they get more and more complex, they get more and more difficult. And this is a fairly straightforward one, but I want to point out that when you look at the description that we developed for this one, that in some ways we're fundamentally changing the flowchart. And that is to make it more readily understandable. We're not changing the actual relation between what you would do one step to the next, but the construction changes slightly. And that, I think it's important to think of creating equal access as not recreating the images in its entirety, but providing an equivalent experience, which you also have to consider the speed with which you can get the important information. Okay? So this is what we did here. We have the title, a flowchart titled Adding an Article to Wikipedia. And we have two major steps. Search Wikipedia, and then a question: is it found? Okay? And then we have, what are the two possible outcomes, yes or no? And for yes, we combined the entire that loop. So is it found? Yes. Think of another term, search Wikipedia. Because there's no alternative. That's the direction you're going to go. You're going to go from that step to that step to that step. So it can be all put in one line. And then you ask, is it found? No. Then is there a related term? And then you have no and yes. Create a new article, create a redirect. You know, there are little things you can change here and there, but that's a very straightforward way, because once you start, well, I'm going to show you an example right here, actually. Here's another flow chart. This is a basic overview of energy and human life, and this looks very much like the other one. It's got little images and it's got arrows, and it looks very straightforward. And if you create a nested list, it actually is unnecessarily complex, as our nice little warning tells us. There's not enough information to describe the relationships between each item. So then what we did was instead sort of went the opposite approach and wrote it into 3 short sentences, and everything flowed much better, and it actually was quicker to understand than trying to figure out the relationships of that nested list. So this reads, a diagram titled Basic Overview of Energy and Human Life. The diagram shows chemical energy, and then in parentheses, carbohydrates, fats, and others going into a human body. Inside the body are ATP, body's energy, currency, and metabolism. Leaving the body are chemical waste, carbon dioxide and water, and heat. So as I said, sometimes you consider an approach and go through with it and then realize that it isn't. And that is really dependent on the image. But you know, it's probably going to be one or the other. Is it going to be a table? Is it going to be a list? And then if not, you know, maybe you have to do something like this. Now I want to get into the sort of the big humdingers here, the tons of info. And I chose maps because maps often are multiple layers of complex information all jammed into a single image, and that's what we have here. And I have 3 different examples. So the first one, what are the parts of this complex description? What's the title? Dam removal by state, 2001 to 2010. The construction of the image is that it's a map that shows bars that relate the number of dam removals in that time period. Summary or overview. This is not a detailed map, so don't bang your head against the screen trying to give specific detailed information, because it's just not there. You have a lot of dam removal in the Northeast and the Great Lakes area, little or none in the center of the country here and in the Southwest, and then you have some over in the Pacific, the states on the West Coast. And that's really what this map is getting across. And maybe the outlier here, and we'll talk about outliers in a second, is Pennsylvania, where you see that's much larger, and actually that's cut off. So Pennsylvania is far and away has the most dam removals in that 9-year period. So that you might want to pull that out. And then the others, it's really a lot here, a little here, and some here. It's you don't need to list every state, and you look at Colorado, you just simply can't tell how many dams have been removed in Colorado. So take the image. I was going to say take the image on face value, but what we show is anyway.
Bryan, can I ask
just
one question? There's
Sure.
a question about what the source of these examples are. Are they from books?
Some are from books. Some are from magazines. That last one was from, I believe it was from Science magazine. And the next 2 are from a high school social studies book. And then some of the other ones are from the web or from open, so sort of open source educational content. I'm totally losing my words. They're from a variety of sources. Many of them are from textbooks, yes. So in any case, this one is a complex image in that it has a lot of information. It really has two separate images. We have the title, of course, Election of 1912, and then we have what's clearly can be converted into a data table, the top, and then the bottom is this map. And the map should, there's three things really to consider about how to describe this map. And right off the bat, I'm going to show you two ways of providing the description of this map. One way would be probably what most people would say is, okay, we have this table on the top that can be converted into a table, and then the map, we're going to just list the information. It's a map of electoral votes, Democratic, and you can combine it. You say want all the states except those listed below, and then describe how California split their votes. Then the next is progressive, list those half a dozen states that progressives won, Republicans won only Vermont and Utah, and socialists won none. Notice we didn't list all of the states that Democrats won, and I'll tell you why in just a second. But there's another way to do it, which would be in your introduction, in the beginning of the image description, you can say that there's a map, and the information for the map has been included as an extra, as the fifth column in the data table, and actually do it that way. So you have column 1 is the party, 2 is the candidate, 3 is electoral votes, 4 is popular vote, and then add a column, say states won. And then the information we just saw on the last slide, you would add here. Okay, so why are we not listing all of the states and the electoral votes listed in each one? Well, for one, unless you are a real geography nut, and depending on the grade and the purpose of the image, you're probably not going to know many of the states other than the one you live in and the ones next to it, and maybe Texas and California and Florida. And so, and the specific electoral votes for each one are added all up here in column 3. Okay, so I've seen many examples where someone will take a map, and the first thing they'll do is list out all the states and provide that information. But this is more of a summary. This map is more of a summary, and really what you're calling out are the purple and green states, those just few states that didn't go to Woodrow Wilson. And so it's okay to say Wilson won every state except for the ones listed below. Okay, now I want to get to the next one, which is a really complex graphic. And I chose maps just so we could keep on a theme here. But the approach of, well, I have it right here, breaking it down into parts. What are we really looking at here? Again, it's a map of the United States. And if you look at the key, there's 3 pieces of information that the map is trying to get across, 3 big blocks of information. What are the time zones? Where were the railroads by 1870, and where were they by 1890? Okay, the light-colored railroads are 1870, the dark-colored railroads are 1890. The first thing you want to do is provide the first piece of information, which is the summary of the time zones. And those are pretty clearly laid out. So you're going to say the East Coast up into the Great Lakes, and down to Savannah, not including Florida. Okay, and maybe add some key cities that are in there. The central time zone goes across the Great Lakes and the south to mid-Texas and up into the Dakotas. The mountains are the states west to the Rockies, and then the Pacific is the states bordering the Pacific Ocean, and then back east to Salt Lake City. So now you've sort of you've divided the country and provided 4 anchors for describing what you're going to do next, which is provide a summary of the railroads by 1870, and do it in relation of time zones. So in terms of, I mentioned cognitive load before, it's important to realize that your whole description is probably going to be read through at least once and done in a linear fashion. So if someone is print disabled, especially if they can't see the graphic, it's so easy for someone who's writing image description to forget that. You would think that you wouldn't forget that fact. But often descriptions are written by someone who's staring at the graphic or the image, writing the description, and then they themselves looking at the image to rely on, to remind themselves what it is they're looking at. So that's why that last piece of advice I gave in the first guidelines, which is have somebody read the image description who hasn't seen the image, is so helpful and really often with complex images can be vital. So anyway, step 2 is you're going to summarize the railroads, the lighter colored railroads, in relation to the time zone. So you have most of the cities of the East Coast connected, and then through the Midwest to Chicago, and then to St. Paul and Kansas City. And then you have one outlier, and it's always important, almost always important, like we saw on that one map with Pennsylvania having the dam removals, to notice the outlier. And that would be the Transcontinental Railroad that goes right across the center of the country through Salt Lake City and down to San Francisco. And so that's very important. And then the final step would be to describe the progress of the railroads that go across the West, both on the north, central, and southern routes there. And to know what specific cities you might mention, or other specifics you would look in the context of the image. Are there questions the student's supposed to answer? Are there, is there information not stated in the text that is relying on the map, or is the entire map described in the text and then the work of the description author is less? Moving on to the next topic of tons of words. Here again is here's an example from the CDC website, and I'm using their description, which is quite good. And you can see that this is a complicated image. There's lots of little icons, there's lots of little graphics, and there's also a lot of words. And what's important here are the words. The graphics are sort of what we tend to call eye candy and don't really provide any more information, and it's really the words. And of course this is about someone's health. It's about finding out, making sure you get tested for Hep C and why you might want to do that and what the warning signs are, and that's the important information. So it's the words that are important, not the little graphics. And we're not advancing here. Here we are. Oops. And so again, break it down into parts. And this has 3 major parts. The information is clearly divided there, and that's how the description writers of the CDC did it. This is a vertical infographic containing a header, footer, and 3 main sections between them, and then it goes right into the information that's provided there, right into the text. And again, so the middle section, a little bit of description, saying that the liver is pointed out and that we have, actually that's what it is. And then you'll notice that there's lots of different fonts, there's lots of different colors being used, there's different size text, and those are distractors for the description writer. In this case, it's the words that are important, and that's what has to be first and foremost, and that's really how the image description should focus on the words and not all of those other things. Everything else is really just to catch the eye of someone, or it's a design feature. And of course, nothing against designers, but the job of the image description is often different than the design of the actual image. And then we get into this one, which I'm not actually going to describe because I read through the caption and I can't even understand what it means at all, which means I'm not a content expert, and I'm sure there might be people on this call who enjoy reading Science magazine on a regular basis and who would think this is child's play. But what I did want to point out, I'm going to grab my little tool here, is that now we know what to look for, okay? Break this down into its parts. I don't know if you can see that. Let me pick a different tool. Here we go. Okay, so we have 4 different, I think it's 4 or 5. So what do we have here? We have A, B, C, D, E, and F, if you're going to be describing. So these are going to be independent of each other. All right. This is a graph. This is probably can be converted into a table, although it looks like the information is very straightforward. It might even be able to be described in a quick sentence. This is an image with one piece of information that's very important. And again, these are microscopic images that can be described fairly quickly. So separate them out, utilize the information that is in the footnote and in the surrounding text, describe it in context, and go from there. I'm going to just talk about approaches for illustrations and cartoons because those are, people often ask me about them and consider them quite complex, cartoons especially. This is only an hour, and I have some other things I want to get to, so I'm going to go over these very briefly. And that is, you'll notice a theme about summarization and cutting to the chase in this training. And here we have 2 thermographs, which you could go into quite a bit of detail. The top one, most of the person is sort of light greenish blue, except for dark blue and red in the head and throat area, the elbow, and the same with the bottom. You know, you can describe very specifically what the thermograph looks like, but that's not going to be very effective description. What you want to do is get the point across very quickly and not require someone to read a long description that isn't, that's not necessary. What do we see right away? We see the top image is mostly blue and green and the bottom is mostly orange and red. Now here's another illustration that seems like it's very straightforward. It's a battle, an illustration of a battle in the Civil War, actually a battle of Gettysburg. But we'll jump back to remembering that context is, in some ways, is everything. Let's read the figure description here that's, or the caption here that's in the text. This engraving of the Battle of Gettysburg reveals the strategic role that land features can play in determining the outcome of a battle. Oh, so actually the job of this illustration has to do with showing, revealing the strategic role that land features can play to determine the outcome of a battle. So the image description actually needs to be longer than maybe you thought at first glance. So always remember, context is going to dictate how you approach the level of detail you get into in describing an image. And quickly, I just want to show one cartoon. I guess I was very heavy on this, these social studies books in this presentation, but they're wonderful illustrations. Cartoons sometimes are very straightforward and simple with stick figures. Sometimes they are really elaborate, like this one. And there is an absolute, there almost is a need in someone who's writing image description to try to get all of the rich visual detail in there. Yet look at the caption. Well, I hardly know which to take first. And really that should be our guide in how long it takes from someone to hear that there's alt text to an image to where they get to the punchline. And if it's, you want to be as brief as possible to get them to the punchline, because that's the point. So what's the setting? Uncle Sam is in a restaurant, and I don't know if you can see this, but it's McKinley. President McKinley is the waiter. It says that on his arm towel there. And the restaurant is the setting. The characters are Uncle Sam and President McKinley as his waiter. And then what are the details as needed? What information do we need to get us from that, from the setting and the 2 characters, down to understanding the punchline? Well, what we need to know is that Uncle Sam is seated at a restaurant, his waiter is President McKinley, and he's staring at a wall menu or a menu with listing Cuba steak, Puerto Rico pig, and the Sandwich Islands. Okay, food related there. And then the caption reads, well, I hardly know which to take first. So let the caption, let the punchline be your guide into how do you get there? How do you set the setting and let the punchline do the work? Don't get in the way. Data visualization, as you probably know, data visualization is an increasingly popular way of expressing in visual terms complex data sets and often multiple live streaming data sets in a visually arresting or visually interesting way. This one you could probably approach simply by pulling out some of the largest words and doing it in sort of a list. But the reason I put this up here is to say that I am not aware of any work that's been done or that's ongoing in methods or approaches of making data visualization. This is actually a fairly straightforward and simple version or example of making those accessible. So if anyone out there is looking for a good grant to write up and research to do, go for it, and I will be very glad if you do. Let's look at the ways that we can add image description to digital media. It's fairly straightforward. When you're working in HTML or EPUB, you have a few options. You have alt text, which is a brief textual alternative text to the image. If you have a much longer description, you can use Longdesk. Longdesk also enables you to use those HTML tools like tables, lists, and MathML. ARIA from the W3C also contains image description properties, and I would encourage you to look at ARIA and how to use that to add image description, especially to HTML pages. If you're working in digital talking books, you also have ALT for short text descriptions and a rough equivalent of Longdesk, which is called ProdNote. For other digital media, you have PDFs, which are very popular. You have the figure tag, which is text only. You can't use markup, but at least you can get some image description there. Similarly, with Microsoft Word, you have alt text that you can find in the image properties menu. And in InDesign, if you're publishing, if you're in publishing or in design and you're using that program, there's also alternate text that you can add to an image. Now, the Diagram Center has been very busy creating tools and resources for adding image description to digital books. The Poet tool is authoring software, image description authoring software. Now, what do I mean by that? The software will take your digital book files, and you can look at the entire book the way it's laid out, or you can look at it in this mode, which lists all of the images in the left-hand column, and then in the right-hand window, you look at an enlarged version of the image, and then you can write your description, and you simply click a button, and it gets coded up and absorbed automatically into the XML file. So it enables your image description writers, your alt text authors, to focus on the content of the image description as opposed to how do I write HTML code? Where do I cut and paste this into my XML file? It takes all of that away, and it enables you to focus on writing image description. Also, you'll notice that there's two boxes here. One says previous descriptions, one says new description, which enables, say, a group of description writers or whatever your production workflow is to do sort of an iterative process. So you can have edits being made, or you could even have some sort of crowdsourced image description. You can watch the YouTube video or go to the Diagram Center website to read more about Poet. I encourage you to do that. And this is a free open source software, so that it's free to use, but it's also open source and available for you to tinker with and alter for your own purposes, depending on the types of digital files you work in and perhaps the type of proprietary situation that you're working within. The content model, very briefly, is essentially it's a standard which creates a container for additional information, mainly two different kinds of information. Say you have this complex image of the water cycle here. What the content model would enable you to do, now the content model is not being used currently right now. We're looking for early adopters, but it enables you to connect multiple alternative elements such as short description, long description, an SVG reference, which could be printed out either as it can be displayed on a monitor, it can be printed out as a tactile graphic, then different simplified descriptions and alternate descriptions, all connected to this one image. And you can also provide different types of metadata. So that's what the content model is. It's essentially a standard that creates a container for information to attach to that image that would then live with that image as it's used in different contexts. Okay, before we get into questions, I just want to go over some of the alternatives to image description, because depending on the complexity of the image, the type of the image description not only is not the only way to provide access, sometimes it's not even a very effective way to do it. And we're going to return to this line graph, and we'll remember we have those four different parts of a complex description: the title, construction of the image, summary, and data. And if you, oops, I forgot to tell you that one way that images are often described, as you know, are done on the fly, someone standing next to a student, or recorded, and not digital text read by a screen reader. And in that case, you would simply read the description. You would write up the description the same way as you would as if it was being read by a screen reader, and you'd read it aloud or record it that way. And then when you get down to the data, which would have been a data table, you read it the same way. I've created a list here which makes it a little easier to read for a narrator. Better for a screen reader user if it is provided as a table. And you'll notice that we set it up in that first sentence. The year is followed by imports in billions of dollars and exports in billions of dollars, and then just the data, as opposed to putting, you wouldn't read 1968, imports $3 billion, exports $2 billion, and the reason is because all those words just become they become very repetitive as you go down the list, where what you really want is to have those numbers read out. Now, that same graphic can be printed out in a raised line graphic or a tactile graphic that we see right here, where the information is provided in Braille, and you can use your finger to follow very quickly and smoothly the trajectory of those two graphs. There's also several companies that are working on what I would call enhanced tactiles, which is a combination of a tactile graphic like this. Sorry, the slide is not advancing. Here we are. That would be connected in the case of this left-hand image to a computer, where you would explore the tactile graphic, and then when you found something you wanted more information in, and there was not enough room to write a full paragraph in Braille, for example, you would press it, and then because it's connected to the computer would trigger either an audio file or a text file that would be read by a screen reader, and that's what this student is doing, is listening on headphones. Here on the right, the computer has been reduced down to a talking pen, and this person is exploring a periodic table. They can, because the table is raised and is tactile and has Braille on it, they can find the element they're looking for, say whatever. They're looking for oxygen, and then to find more information, because writing it in Braille would take a whole page or so, they simply tap it with the pen, and that has the recorded information in it. And then, of course, there are manipulatives, things you can pick up, and three-dimensional items that you can use, explore with your hands, like these stick and ball chemical compounds we see on the left. There's lots and lots of these sort of rubberized manipulatives. This one is the inside, the human organs. There's all sorts of animals and other types of things that really, you know, a paragraph describing the organs of a human body is never going to do the wonderful job that actually being able to take them out in this rubberized manipulative is going to do. And then every in every TVI's bag are wiki sticks, because you can very quickly and easily replicate lots of images and graphics using wiki sticks, and that's done all the time on the fly in the classroom for students. And because we live in the future, now you can simply potentially print out 3D tactiles or manipulatives using software and a 3D printer that are now the costs are coming down and they're becoming easier to use. So that is going to be is currently and probably will be more and more an avenue for creating alternatives to complex images. And almost the virtual mirror of the 3D printer is the haptic glove or other haptic technology where you would virtually, two examples here are you could virtually touch a human brain or rub someone's giant nose. I don't know why you'd want to do that, but this is what the future looks like. There's also, moving away from that type of technology, there are folks working on just using the tablets that we see every day, using the vibration function in those tablets to make almost a smart image. And I went back to the map theme here, where you could move around an image, and the way that the vibration is set, it would almost be like a tactile or one of those enhanced tactiles where you could drill down as you explore an image using that functionality of a tablet. Again, that and the haptic technology and 3D printers are technologies that we're seeing as possibilities, but aren't really being used every day, certainly now. So here is my contact information, and we've left a little bit of time for questions. So I will take a breath and let Julie jump in.
Thank you, Bryan. We've got some terrific questions here, and we may not have time to get to them all, so I want to assure people that if you asked a question, we've captured them and we'll get an answer to you. So there were a few questions, Bryan, about how to decide what level of detail to go into, and this was back when you were talking about maps. There were a couple of related questions, so I'm going to ask them together. Someone asked, with the dam removal map, isn't there a lot of state-by-state comparative information that's lost if you only give a general description by region? And then a related question having to do with, when you create the description, Kathy says, I assume you have to take into account the audience and the goal of the assignment. So do you want the student to remember the exact data, like the number of electoral votes, or just identify a trend? And can you talk about how you determine what level of information to provide?
Sure. And this is where description becomes an art and not as much art as it is science. I always liken it to sort of creative technical writing, because the balance is just that. How much detail to give when you know that someone who is not relying on the description, someone who can see the image, is able to scan it quickly and hopefully get the information that they need. Even if it takes a while with the image, they can quickly say, well, here's information I don't need. And when you're providing image description, often that is a difficult but necessary step, which is not to provide all of the 1,000 words that image may be worth, and saying, what's the most important information? The other thing to do is, if you are in a real quandary and you're using drill down technique, going from the most general to the more specific, take that dam removal slide image and say, if you decide, reading the context, reading the figured caption, that really is important, that I want to get, that for some reason maybe there's an end of chapter question that is, and that would be something that would tip the scales to, yes, of course I have to provide that information. And that would go at the end. Maybe it would go in a data table, maybe it would go in a long list. But again, well, that one had the states labeled. When we had the electoral map, those states weren't labeled. So, take any number of kids in the class that are supposed to be using that image to learn from. How many states can they name? Is that really the point of it? Now, of course, because you have time and you have access to search engines or other maps, you can provide that as an image description author, but is that more information than the cited student is going to have? What's that balance? Also, for better or worse, image description is usually done in it is a production process, and you don't only want image descriptions that a student can read effectively and efficiently and isn't giving them a lot of information that is extraneous, but also in the production process of writing descriptions. Remember, you want to get the materials out to students as quickly and as close to real-time, on-time. I need this in class, or this is being produced, and I need to read this on day one, whether it's for the web or it's an educational setting. So there are those pressures to consider, production pressures. Hope that was helpful.
Thank you, Bryan. And since we just have a couple of minutes left in the hour, I'll ask one more. And again, to all of those who've asked questions we haven't touched on yet, we will capture them and get back to you. But there were several questions sparked by the CDC hepatitis image. And sure. They had to do with how much to focus on details of the visuals. So for example, you mentioned the hourglass shape and the hepatitis graphic. Why is that useful information for someone to know about? Is the detail of the visual graph important to the description, or do you feel it alters the focus of the factual information? And finally, sure. The on-screen text describes the banner and other layout features. I thought from what you were saying, we should actually drop those kinds of visual components that don't carry any relevant data. So those were the questions related to that. Sure.
And wow, am I glad people were paying such close attention. And I think I said up top that this was described by the CDC, and I would have, and I guess what I should have said is that you're always going to find variations in description, and I read a lot of image descriptions, and this one I would mark up there quite high. Is it exactly the way I would have described it? No, I probably wouldn't have described the hourglass, so thank you for pointing that out. I might have approached some things differently, but it is a very good example of not spending time on, like I kept repeating about the font. I can't tell you how often I read descriptions that focus on things like that. Well, this is in red, this is bolded, this is underlined, the font changes here, or this is this is offset here with a squiggly line, blah blah blah. So yes, the person who wrote this alt description did do a little, did describe a couple of elements. Maybe I would have even made it simpler and cut those out, but it is still a very good example, and I'm trying to call it up. It's not coming up for some reason. It is a very good example, and even in effective, well-written descriptions that are, I always like to say, efficient and effective, there are going to be variations. And I hope that that is in somewhat a comfort to people who are required to be writing image descriptions for complex images, because it can be very hard work, it can be daunting, and to know that there's not one standard. Things can vary from one author to another as long as there's relative consistency, certainly across either a website or a book or a series of books or coursework if you're in that kind of setting, especially if you're in an assessment. Consistency is very important. But thank you for watching so closely and pointing those out. That's great.
Well, Bryan, I know that everybody joins me in thanking you for a fabulous webinar. I have several comments here saying how wonderful it was, and also a request to share the questions and answers with everybody in a follow-up, and I will certainly do that. There were questions here we didn't get to, but we will create a question and answer sheet to send around to all of the participants. So thank you, everybody, for joining us today.
Ladies and gentlemen, that does conclude the webinar for today. We thank you for your participation and ask that you please disconnect your lines.